Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event on 5G spectrum, wireless communications, and innovation in Canada, put on by The Logic. We are a digital independent news organization. We report on the innovation economy in Canada, partly from a business perspective and partly from the perspective of the people who are going to live in the innovation economy in 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Where we're going, how governments can enable it or sometimes get in the way, how businesses are acting and reacting and pushing us forward, and what that's going to mean for our lives. My name is David Reevely. I am an Ottawa reporter here at The Logic. Ottawa is on the unceded traditional land of the Algonquin people, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will be talking about 5G spectrum and where this country is going with it. This event is produced with sponsorship from TELUS, which of course is a player in these discussions. Aside from helping us set it up and paying for it, they have no role in the discussion that we're about to have. And if they tried, that would go poorly for them. So let me introduce the people we're going to be hearing from. First up is Ben Morris, who is the Vice President of Corporate Development and Technology Strategy at Wesley Clover, which is the investment, venture capital vehicle for Terry Matthews, the godfather of numerous technology companies in this country and around the world. We have Janette Stewart, who is a partner at Analysis Mason, which is a UK-based consultancy, which does a lot of work on broadband and internet and wireless communication issues. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that she, through Analysis Mason, has done some work for TELUS. It is probably impossible to find someone who is expert enough to be useful talking about spectrum in Canada, who has not either worked for TELUS or for its competitors, but you should know that that's part of her background. And we have Jad Berberi, who is the Director of Solutions Architecture for Samsung Electronics. He is expert particularly in handsets and how handsets need to be engineered to work with different spectrum allocations. And the final members of this event are you in the audience. We will be taking questions, which you should please insert into the chat in the technology platform, and they'll be passed to me, and we'll try to weave things that you want to hear about into the conversation or just ask about them straight out. So with that, let's begin. There we go. There's the panel. I want to begin by making this discussion as concrete as we possibly can. And I'll take this question to each of you in turn. But I'm going to start with Ben Morris. Now, as it happens, this morning I was watching a city council committee meeting here in Ottawa that had Terry Matthews in it. And one of the things that stuck with me was he was talking about the communications revolution that 5G is going to bring. He talked about it as a $1 trillion opportunity looked at globally. And Wesley Clover is investing in companies that are trying to take advantage of that huge opportunity. But for me as a consumer, I pick up my cell phone. Sometimes it says 5G up in the corner. Sometimes it says 4G or LTE. To me, I don't necessarily notice that much difference. But I think for 5G, I as a consumer using my phone am not necessarily supposed to yet. So can you maybe give us some insight into what sorts of innovations are coming down the pipe that in a year or two, the average person might look at and say, ooh, that's cool. And you, as someone who are expert, will say, that's 5G.
David, I think you're asking the $1 trillion question that we're all trying to figure out at the moment. So, way to not hold back on the first question. Look, we are so bullish, within the investment community, the VC community, so bullish, on the sort of innovation globally as it relates to 5G, just because it is, and it represents such a transformational shift for, us and technology in general. We tech is very good at going through different waves. We are currently in this massive cloud adoption wave, and 5G is sort of the enablement layer for this next layer of next gen applications And so I'll tease you with a quick idea before sort of getting into some more specifics in terms of what excites us here at Wesley Clover. Just looking at statistics recently, 60% of all network traffic today in Canada comes from applications that were not invented 10 years ago. TikTok, Facebook video, YouTube, Netflix, the list goes on and on. None of those really existed less than 10 years ago. Certainly they didn't exist less than 10 years ago. And so to consider, that 10 years ago, and in fact, this month we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of 4G or LTE being rolled out in Canada, to think now that at the beginning of 5G, hey, we're going to imagine what the next apps are going to be on the network, or what the next cool things are going to be that drive real revenues and real, action and sort of benefit for Canadians. I think it's a little bit difficult. So I would much rather focus on the platform, what we should be doing to level the playing field, create an innovative environment, encouraging companies to ideate, innovate, start. Those are certainly sort of themes and focus areas for me on this call today.
And yet, I want something specific. Where do you think there's hope and something that somebody's actually going to see in front of them pretty soon?
So certainly from a consumer perspective, 5G represents, massive broadband throughput, super low latency. That experience on your mobile phone is just going to get better and better and better. That 5G will bring that to consumers. But where we see, significant benefit and advantage for 5G is around enterprise applications. And so, there's a lot of talk about telerobotics. There's a lot of talk about automation. There's a lot of talk about, Industry 4.0. Those are all great. And yeah, we're going to see tons of activity in that space, autonomous vehicles, all of those sorts of things. I can tell you where I am most looking forward to my first 5G experience, and that will be on a golf course later this summer, when I can order food and beverage from my mobile handset and have it delivered via 5G autonomous connected drone to my golf cart. That is what I am most looking forward to this summer, and I am not teasing you. That is something we are doing within Wesley Clover and the Canada Business Association campus this summer.
That is definitely whiz-bang cool. Janette Stewart, what's something cool that the average consumer might see either later this summer or maybe a couple of years down the line that 5G is going to enable?
Well, I think I was going to say that, I think what's interesting about 5G is it's probably the first mobile generation where innovation will come not just from consumer applications, but also enterprise and industrial applications. And that might be where we see the real innovation occurring in sort of smart manufacturing, smart agriculture, etc. But for consumers, I think what 5G will enable is things that you can do anyway on a 4G smartphone. 5G will do it better. Initial 5G networks have been set up to largely just increase capacity for consumers, so that as mobile data consumption continues to grow, then networks can be more responsive to that, so things will be faster, better. But I think innovation can result from that additional capacity. So things like more sort of immersive experiences, sort of entertainment experiences, live entertainment where you can interact, and sort of immersive tourism, sort of retail opportunities as well, where you can sort of use augmented reality, virtual reality. I think there's a lot of innovation there. So that would be what I would be thinking in the consumer space.
Is it fair to maybe compare it to the difference between dial-up internet and broadband internet? It's still the internet, it's still the web, but the first time, if you're old enough, you plugged in a computer to broadband internet and compared it to what you were used to getting over a dial-up modem. It was quite startling, I think.
Yes, possibly. Or I think going from sort of more basic broadband to sort of super fast, is maybe a good comparison as well, because, what we're getting with 5G is more like what, as a fixed consumer, you could consume on a fiber network, for example.
Okay. That makes sense. Jad Berberi, your turn. What difference will the consumer notice once 5G is all over the place?
I think first we need to understand the philosophy behind 5G actually, before we jump into what the consumer will directly actually experience. And from philosophy perspective, to understand the 5G, why it was built like this, and we need to understand the evolution of the technology. So as an example, 2G GSM was built for voice. When we built the GSM, it was built to deliver voice. Then we ended up saying we need data. So then the industry said, you know what, we're going to actually put data on GSM. And then they came up with the GPRS Edge, which unfortunately, the GSM was not meant to deliver data at best. So we came up with a 3G actually, which was data and voice. And it wasn't actually the best way to deliver if you want data application. So we moved to the 4G, which was meant to make everything, all the application over data. So you can see the voice being over data. You can see also the voice and everything over data. Now, what's the challenge of the 4G? 4G is really built for only mainly for MBB, mobile broadband. So now the 5G is a different philosophy. I mean, I would say it's more actually a non-engineering driven technology, where actually the industry thought, what are the categories that we have today? And the NMT or the IMT 2020, they actually came up with 3 types of categories, which is the enhanced mobile broadband, which what we are talking about, and also 2 other main applications, which are the massive machine-to-machine and the ultra reliable low latency. So the challenge now is like we have a triangle. We have 3 challenges. We have 3 types of applications and categories that requires different technical requirements. So how can we deliver, for example, today, application like to have a smart city, a huge number of connected devices, which requires actually a lot of connectivity. At the same time, how can we do like V2X, which is the vehicle connected to the network, which requires a low latency? You can't do it over 4G. You have to build many networks. So the 5G build this, if you want, philosophy of totally different actually network, which is a revolution. So we're going to see actually a totally a revolution on things, more than actually what I'm going to experience, first of all, on my personal phone. I'm going to see actually connected vehicles. I'm going to be able to see secure cities and so on and so on, and definitely enhance security. Now, when we go back to the mobile broadband, definitely there are much more. We're going to be able to have 10 times more speeds and better latency, and this will enable us for new kind of applications, which definitely we're going to see the industry coming up with new applications, like definitely augmented reality, virtual reality. Imagine yourself, you have a goggle actually, and I'm not a handyman, so I'm going to be connected to someone, I don't know where. He's going to tell me what to do. And I'm just in my home, I don't know where he's located. So
let's talk about some of those.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put this question to Ben Morris first, though. What are some of the exciting industrial applications, things that the consumer will not see directly, but that will, if everything goes as one hopes, make the economy work better?
Look, I think for a lot of these applications, it will be an evolution, not necessarily a revolution. 5G unlocks new capabilities. 5G unlocks new use cases. 5G unlocks new ways of transacting, on a commercial level. And so, as investors in about 100 companies today, in terms of an active portfolio that we manage, we are very proactively encouraging the CEOs of our tech companies to look at 5G as a way to not transform their business, but capture new opportunities and perhaps evolve their business models to capture more wallet share of their customers. And so I'll tease you with a couple examples. Today, we have a business in our portfolio called SolLink. They provide video security capabilities to about 11,000 locations of different brands around the world, including a very large coffee chain in Canada. SolLink today rely on third-party internet connections in this particular case, within their customer locations. And those internet connections are sometimes, difficult to troubleshoot, difficult to connect into, and often provide the source of a significant number of trouble tickets or support issues for SolLink. And so what 5G will enable SolLink to do as an example, is to ship a 5G SIM as part of the hardware that they provide to the customer. They include that capability as part of the monthly fee. And now the customer has a much more seamless 5G connected, perhaps even secure 5G slice connected application, where Solink was previously able to charge, say, $200 a month for that capability. But now because they're bundling in the connectivity, they can charge $300 a month and create additional stickiness with their customer. They can create additional security for their customer. They can integrate things like point of sale system data that is highly sensitive for certain customer types. And again, provide all of that in a very seamless and secure and much more quality controlled way. Again, very simple example, but that is upon us today, and something that, you know, one business, for example, is taking very, very seriously.
Jad Berberi, I want to put a question from the audience.
You can call me Jad. You don't need to call me with my family name.
I want everyone to know exactly who they're hearing from. Autonomous vehicles are kind of the classic use case, I think, for 5G. That's the if you're going to pick one thing, very often that's what people talk about. And you mentioned smart cities and communications among vehicles. What is it about 5G technology that enhances the capacity of autonomous vehicles to be autonomous?
Actually, for the V2X application, if we want to call it, it's not only capacity, it's latency, what is very important. And latency, I mean, without going into the technical details, the type of the air interface that was built in 4G, what we call subcarrier spacing, is actually will give you a sort of, you have a hard limitation on latency, right? So it's the laws of physics. So now in 5G, and when we offer spectrum like C-band, 3.5 gigahertz or 3.7 gigahertz, we are able actually to reduce the TTI, to reduce, let's call it the latency, the time to have this vehicle talking to whatever actually control unit it has to talk to. And this capability, through actually advancement in the air interface that we bring in 5G, was it C-band or millimeter wave, will enable kind of application, what we call V2X or ultra reliable low latency. So this is a kind of the air interface that we are bringing, which is much more flexible, totally actually flexible compared to the 4G, that enables such kind of application. Now, also, we have to be, I mean, I don't want to always to throw marketing stuff. Today, we are in the early stage. So today, from industry perspective, when we go to the 3GPP, which is the standard body that actually where we define the standards, we are definitely in the early stage of those technologies. Network slicing, for example, which is the most important thing, to be able actually to have different slices and SLAs, a slice for V2X, a slice for secure smart cities, and so on, so on. We are at the early stage. We need definitely to see this in a couple of years, and definitely I mean, we have always to put it. Definitely, operators are looking for new revenues. They are not a charity organization, but at the same time, we need to understand that we are here in the industry also to provide better services to people. It's not only about money. It's also more than this. It's how we can provide to our society, to our families, better services, better actually use cases, right? Definitely, we're not actually making ourselves, I mean, a charity organization. We never actually said so, but the aim, the target, the motivation is how we can enhance our society use cases and so on, so on. Yeah.
Janette Stewart, Analysis Mason did an analysis of the potential for 5G in the EU in particular, that dug into various industrial sectors where you anticipate it'll make the most difference and lead to the best returns. What were the standout industrial segments that you think will benefit?
Yeah, so we did a study that looked at sort of various segments: manufacturing, sort of rural industries, agriculture, etc. So, I mean, one of the the areas that we did look at is sort of smart factories, connectivity and manufacturing. And the motivation there is that connectivity in manufacturing does exist today. Sometimes it uses wireless connection, sometimes it uses LTE or Wi-Fi, sometimes it uses fixed cabling, but that can be costly, it can be difficult to scale because it's constrained by the stationary asset of the cabling. So 5G can enable flexibility, it gives you the real-time data capture and processing. So an example then is managing machine operation. So you can have wireless sensors fitted in machines, and then that gives information, for example, on the wear of the machine, whether it's performing optimally. That can be processed in real time. So that means you can preemptively fix faults before the machine breaks down. So that means that either machine times, operating times can be increased. You could increase your outputs, and that leads to productivity benefits. So that's one of the examples that I suppose is a standout example there of where 5G can increase output, and then that leads to both innovation and economic output in terms of productivity.
So all of this depends on access to the wireless spectrum that 5G will use. And I realize there are various sort of tranches on which what we call 5G will operate, but we're concerned, I think, today primarily with the 3,500 megahertz and 3,800 megahertz. And in Canada, as you all know, we've auctioned off 3,500 megahertz spectrum and are preparing for the next big auction of 3,800 megahertz spectrum. And making sure that we get that next tranche right, I think, is the key to unlocking all of the benefits here that we're talking about. So, Jad, based on how we auctioned the first big slab of 5G spectrum, what concerns would you have about this country's capacity to make the most of 5G? Like, let's say that 3,500 was it, and we didn't have this other section coming. What are we prepared for, and what did we kind of ace ourselves out
of? I mean, first of all, I mean, let me do a step backward a little bit. So one thing we need to understand that LTE, because we sometimes forget basic and important things, LTE was the sort of unification of two tracks, which are CDMA track and 3GPP track UMTS. Now, the challenge that we faced for 4G that we couldn't actually have, we had a lot of fragmentation actually on spectrum, a lot. When you look at the spectrum globally, it was really a bit like of a chaos. When you look at the 700, the US band, you look at the other band, it was a bit catastrophic to a certain extent. Now, what we tried to do in 5G, we tried as an industry to come up with unified spectrum. The 3.5 gigahertz spectrum is one very important spectrum globally. Now, when we talk about 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, and if you look at the spectrum globally, you look at it in the US, you look at it in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, China, and so on, you still see it's not totally actually unified. And this is actually where I think personally what we needed, and we still need, when we are actually thinking about any spectrum, we have to think about it not only, I know that there is a timing, time to market to bring a spectrum quickly into the market and to benefit from our operators with 5G, but at the same time, we need to think about like policies that think a bit bigger picture. To be more specific, I would have been more in favor of seeing 3.7 gigahertz spectrum policy being done at the same time as 3.5 gigahertz in Canada. Why? Because without going into technical details, when you actually go into the technical details, when you are actually building a product, because like I'm in the product section, we build solution on the wireless, not on the handset, by the way. So on the more, although we have the handset part of Samsung. So when you have fragmentation, compare our 3.5 gigahertz spectrum auction result, add into a 3.8 in the future, add the spectrum sharing that you have between some of the carriers, compare it to any other markets, you end up with actually a crazy combination of two carriers. And this requires actually products which are customized to Canada. And when we customize, actually, this will actually increase the cost on our operators. But at the same time, that will increase the cost on our subscriber indirectly. Because in the end, how are you going to get your money? You're going to get it from the people. We are the one who are paying the cost of those equipment. So that's why I would have preferred personally, okay, and this is not maybe a Samsung official position, not to bind my company, that actually we have more policies that think big picture, okay? And try actually to have more contiguous spectrum between the different carriers, not to have a carrier here in 3.5, another carrier in 3.7, 100 megahertz away. Then you need, without using technical, words, IBW, which are different, OBW. And when you go into the chipset, the capability today on the chipset and the challenges of the chipset supply chain, and add all of this together to develop new products which are for Canada with capability, targeting what we are going to see, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge.
And Jad, I don't mean to jump on here,
Yeah.
but I can tell you from an investment perspective, it drives us crazy. You know, when we look around the world and communicate, I should caveat, for Wesley Glover, communications is a big thing. It's a theme for us. It's been something Terry's done for 50 years. It's where he's had his success. And as a result, that's where most of our investment activities are focused. Cloud communications, enterprise apps, those sorts of things. And so when I look around the world and I see the success that we have in creating young tech companies in environments that are much more open, much more competitive, much more policy driven, those activities actually generate some significant results with yield that we are missing in Canada. You know, as Canadians, we should be, and we are very proud of some of the massive technical innovations that we brought to the world. You know, Nortel, BlackBerry, there's a long list of them. Shopify today, again, the list is very, very long. The reason why, you know, BNR and Nortel were successful is because they had a real invisible helping hand behind the scenes to move that company along in the early days in order for them to become a global giant. You know, and they were a global giant. They were an industry leader. But the table needs to be set appropriately to help generate and encourage that type of innovation. And so when I see some of the questions that that are coming in from the audience, you know, will 5G help or, you know, for example, is 5G required to drive autonomy in the automotive sector? No. Cars are going to have to be able to drive on their own without a network connection because you need failovers. You know, there are certain protections that need to be put into place. So 5G is not the great enabler of autonomous vehicles. However, 5G is actually the great enabler for autonomous vehicles and adoption and the creation of an entirely new category of applications that we have not yet invented. You know, 5G with its low latency is going to be used as a form of communication between the charger and the network. Is it okay to put massive amounts of power into a charger that goes into a car for rapid charging purposes? I'm a true believer that 5G is an enabler for that type of capability. Not required yet because we don't have the penetration of EVs in our society today to make a massive difference. But when it becomes, you know, mainstream, you're absolutely going to need those sort of network connected apps. You are also going to need some level of trust. You are going to need to trust the network. You are going to need to trust the environment where those applications and where that data is hosted. We have for too long as Canadians allowed a lot of that valuable, rich data to leave our borders. You know, hyperscalers are wonderful. They are the great equalizer. They make it really easy for developers to build cool stuff really quickly. But the trade-off is that there's only a few hyperscalers on the planet, Amazon, Google, you know, Azure, Microsoft. And, you know, there's no reason we can't be bringing some of that stuff back. But until we have a landscape and policies in place that really encourage that type of innovation, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for our companies to catch up because it's always going to be easier to go south of the border.
So let's take a couple of those audience questions that are relevant to what you've been talking about. I'm going to put the first one to Janette, and it's from Jackson Hamilton, one of the later ones to come in. And the question is, how does spectrum licensing in Canada help or hinder the deployment of private 5G applications for industrial Internet of Things solutions? Basically, if I'm understanding that correctly, how does spectrum licensing enable or get in the way of some of these connected factories that you were talking about?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, these connected factories could use private 5G networks, which are delivered by a mobile network operator using network slices, and that would use the spectrum that is licensed to the mobile operator, such as in the 3.5 spectrum that has already been licensed in Canada, or the 3.8, which is being auctioned. In some markets, though, regulators have set aside spectrum specifically for deployers of private 5G networks. So that would enable a manufacturing company to choose somebody to deploy its 5G private network on its behalf. That could be, they could choose an MNO to do that, or they could choose somebody entirely different, an entirely different third party, but there would be spectrum available to do that. And in several markets in Europe now, Germany, for example, France, and the UK as well, where I'm based, there is what's called locally licensed spectrum or shared access spectrum, where those private networks can be deployed by third parties. But there's a question about choice here, that some manufacturing companies will choose a third party who is not an MNO to deploy their private networks, whereas some manufacturing companies may choose the mobile operator themselves to run the network. And so I think for regulators, it's important to make sure that there is sufficient flexibility in the spectrum, and to make sure that the spectrum is not just available in a timely manner, but also the bandwidth is sufficient, both for the mobile operators and potentially to sort of encourage this more innovative use of sort of locally licensed spectrum. So I think it's a combination of the two things.
Actually, oh no, please go ahead.
Allow me to add into what Janette just mentioned, which I totally agree with you. Recently, I mean, we're working on public safety. I mean, like any other vendor, nothing secret, nothing confidential. So, and definitely one of the challenges is, like, you don't have spectrum here for private network at all. Yeah, using the mobile operator spectrum is an option, but then you have definitely to go with either TELUS or Bell or Rogers or whatever operator. Now, interesting enough, when we look at our what we are doing, Samsung Electronics in US, we have seen how much the CBRS spectrum, which initially, personally, I had low, estimation for this spectrum. I look at it, it's like it's a wasted spectrum. That was my personal opinion, and then I look at it. You know what? No, I'm totally wrong. Look how much the CBRS is today being used really for by enterprise, for private networks, and so on and so on. And we have developed actually many products as Samsung Electronics to actually offer customers CBRS product, which actually provide good speeds for different applications. So I think here in Canada, we need to have something. We need to think about the private networks on a spectrum level. Do we need to dedicate any spectrum? Can we do it license shared access? And again, everything, you cannot just come up with whatever you want, right? You have to align with other actually countries, because in the end, you have challenges, which are chipset. You cannot just come up as a Canadian, as Canada. We don't have the volume, the sufficient volume to drive an ecosystem by ourselves. I mean, we don't like it maybe, but this is a fact. So we need to look and try to align with other markets. Now, definitely CBRS is not anymore an option, but we have to think about it, see maybe Europe, if it's doing LSA over some spectrum, maybe we can try to align with them.
And Jad, I would just add, again, with my investor hat on, I really like what happens within this CBRS alliance. It's a great, ecosystem, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in next generation applications. It's created an entirely new category of industry. It is serving the needs of industrial, requirements very, very well. There's all sorts of innovations in dynamic spectrum, management, which some Canadian companies are benefiting from, by the way, not that it's applicable here in Canada, but it is driving the cost of some of those connected networking requirements down. And again, because the US is further ahead on this particular subject, it's driving some innovation in the space. And again, that all turns into exports and goes outside. We do not have the same benefit here in Canada at the moment.
Janette, it looked like there were a couple of points where you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to just build on what's been said here. I mean, I think one point that probably the Canadian carriers would see as being very important is that in other markets as well, spectrum in the mid-band has been designed to ensure that operators can have sufficient contiguous spectrum. So the 100 megahertz block is the sort of ideal. Now, Canada obviously has done this two-stage assignment. They're not the only market that's done that. US has done it as well. There have been several auctions in the US, but Canada at the moment is in the situation where the operators don't have the same size of bandwidth in mid-band as in some of the other 5G markets. And so hopefully the 3.8 auction will correct that. But there are some considerations, I think, the private network spectrum is an interesting one, whether you dedicate spectrum for that or whether you do something else, and whether you dedicate spectrum in the mid-band or you dedicate spectrum in another band. In Europe, for example, the 2.6 gigahertz band has been used. There's also this interesting set aside of spectrum in Canada for the smaller players as well, which I think is interesting, sort of raises some trade-offs there. So there's quite a lot of balance to for the regulator to think about here. But sort of ultimately from an innovation perspective, I think we're all agreeing that these private networks are, a potentially important part of the overall 5G jigsaw. And it is important, I think, to consider that.
Yeah, that contiguous 100 meg block is key.
Can you explain why?
Well, I look, at the end of the day, it comes down to being able to realize the full potential of 5G. If, what are the benefits of 5G? Massive bandwidth, massive throughput, massive density. So, move to 1 million devices per cell site, for example, massive management, new slicing capabilities, new enterprise security capabilities, new direct connect capabilities into the hyperscalers. There's all sorts of new things. In order to fully realize those benefits, you need the ability to you need to be able to exercise what is within the scope of 5G. And when you limit what blocks are available, you limit what capability you can push down the pipe. And therefore it just becomes, again, back to something, that Jad said earlier. Canada is unique in the fact that, it needs its own unique product from a radio perspective to be developed, to be able to satisfy the requirements in this market. We don't want to be suffering from the same thing on the application development side. Why should an application behave differently in Canada versus somewhere else where, there's a much more wide open playing field? That's sort of the genesis and the foundation for the argument.
So, Jad, you work in Canada for a global company that works in many, many, many markets. If our spectrum is chopped up, continues to be chopped up, what are the implications for the availability of these sorts of technologies for Canadian, not just consumers, but Canadian industry?
I can talk for hours on this one, actually. No, you're going to kick me out easily. Look, I mean, I have to say honestly.
What are your couple biggest points?
Okay, yeah. I'm going to try to simplify it without going into technical. I mean, my tendency to go into technical things. Look, let me say honestly, and I don't know if we had, for example, like Ericsson or Nokia, our competitors, I think they would agree with me that we have the most complicated configuration maybe all over the world. Why? Because look at our spectrum. You have a 600, you have a 700, you have an 850, you have a PCS, you have a 2.3, AWS1, 3, 4, 2.6, band 7, band 38. If I count them, there are so many compared to any other country, even to US. So you need a base station. You need to configure this. And this is actually, we are totally, we're far more complicated than any other market. Now, I want you to think about spectrum like a pipe, maybe a pipe of water. So today, if you have a lot of fragmentation, initially, what was the solution? I'm going to take one spectrum on my phone and I'm going to have my data. That was the early days of 4G. Then we came up with what? With what we call spectrum. Technically, we call it carrier aggregation. I'm going to call it spectrum aggregation. That is what? I'm going to have a pipe of 3.5 as an example, okay? Another pipe of AWS spectrum to feed my phone to give me higher throughput. Now, it seems very easy. You're going to tell me, yeah, why not you have all the pipes of all the spectrum? Unfortunately, this is not how it works. The way it works is as such. You need first to define those different combination of pipes in 3GPP. You need Qualcomm, the chipset, to support it. And you need the handset, the OEM, the Samsung phones, the Apple phones to support it. And when you see this life cycle, actually, usually the OEM will look and say, which other market has those combinations? Because in the end, there is definitely economy of scale. When you see that we are actually drifting a bit different, and since we have a European spectrum with a US spectrum, some of our spectrum align with Europe, and some of it aligns with the US, that combination makes it extremely difficult to have those combinations on our phone for our consumer to benefit from it. So those are the challenges actually that we face, definitely. So going to what actually Ben mentioned, definitely, I mean, when you have this fragmentation on 3.5, you have a 30 megahertz here. Like, I do understand Industry Canada, when they open it over a tier 4, for example, they give opportunity for many players to get this spectrum. But at the same time, can you imagine how many configurations you have as a vendor and as an operator? And how actually, and what's the main difference actually of 5G versus LTE? In LTE, we had 20 megahertz blocks. In UMTS, we had 5 megahertz block. In 5G, we actually, the objective is to go towards 100 megahertz and massive MIMO to be able to deliver this user experience, which actually differentiate you from the 4G. If we fail to do so, if we deliver a 30 megahertz spectrum, we actually fail to deliver what we need to deliver our actually carrier, the kind of bandwidth that they should have compared to UK, compared to China, compared to any other actually country in the world.
So I'm gonna, one last question before I go around the horn to wrap up. I'm going to put this to Ben, and just knocked off the question I was going to ask because I think it's a really interesting one. It comes from Derek Leverington, and the question is: are elected officials in Canada engaged in this vision of a 5G enabled future? Do they understand what's going on, and do they understand what's at stake?
I think some of them do, for sure. You know, I think we can all respect that there's a difficult job that people are trying to manage and balance, you know, in the interest of Canadians, in the interest of access to technology, in the interest of public safety. You know, there's a lot of things at play, and you know, I'm glad I don't have that job. That's not an easy one. Where I do think we could be doing a little bit better, and I do think there's an opportunity here for people, and I have some hope that that we're going in this direction, is really around, you know, appreciating that 5G is this transformative capability. And as a country of knowledge workers and very educated people, we have an opportunity to ideate and create new companies and new applications in our own backyard that can be tested here first, that can be commercialized here first, and that can be exported globally. And we can have, you know, the next Nortel or the next, you know, Amazon that was created on our own backyard. Before we can get there, you know, we need a set of policies and a vision that is something that the government encourages, that really excites and brings industry together to focus on, you know, a common problem or challenge that we all see and believe in. And so, you know, to answer your question perhaps a little bit more succinctly or specifically, David, I do think they're listening. I do think there's a great opportunity, and I do think that people are are prepared to try something different and really double down on a vision for this country as it relates to connectivity and communications. So I'm hopeful.
So I'm going to put each of you in this scenario. You've got 30 seconds to grab the big brain that's designing the next spectrum auction in Canada. 30 seconds to say one thing that you really want to make sure they get. I'm going to start with Jad, and then Janette, and then Ben to close out. What would you say, Jad?
Specifically on C-band, you're asking? Because like that's the
next round, the 3800.
I think, honestly, we need to be very specific, honestly. We need clarity on the WBS portion, for example, right? I mean, seriously, we have the WBS portion, which is shifting without going into a lot of details. We need to understand as an industry, do we need to provide actually support for the Canadian consumer? We cannot wait for another actually year to understand the WBS, if it's going to be low power, high power, if it's going to be included, yes or no. We need this alignment from day one, understand the whole spectrum policy from day one. We cannot fragment it.
Janette, what's the one thing you would say?
So I think the one thing I wanted to highlight that we haven't discussed already is coverage. So I mean, Canada is a country with a large rural area. And so the inclusion of coverage obligations in Canada has been an important part of your options. I would say, though, that there are other incentives that regulators and policymakers can use to improve coverage, so rather than just obligations. And so there are some interesting examples in other markets which could be explored. And I think just in the Canadian context, there is a trade-off between the way the coverage obligation is set out in Canada, where you have this obligation that it's more onerous on operators that have a larger LT footprint. You need to trade that off against the other things that are in place, such as national roaming and the set aside of spectrum for smaller players. So that's my thing, I think, is coverage obligations, just making sure that you have the correct incentives there.
Oh, Janette, Janette's touching a nerve. Here's why, just to sort of keep it high level and fun. So I don't disagree with you, Janette. However, in an experience that I had a few weeks ago, driving from London Heathrow out to Wales, trying to have a few conference calls along, this 2-hour journey along the motorway, the M4, which is the equivalent of the 401, in Canada, in Ontario. Having a contiguous call that doesn't drop is a challenge, and that's a short, densely populated journey versus what we have, in our country, where you can pretty much have a call from coast to coast. And so for me, that wouldn't be a priority. A priority for me at the moment, and where I think there's a ton of opportunity, is when I look at the amount of money that goes into the spectrum auction, and I look at the amount of money that the operators are spending to acquire that auction, that spectrum. I have my investor hat on, and I think, oh, wow, what could we do with a couple $2 billion to foster and support and drive innovation in this country? So it's not that the operators don't want to fund or buy spectrum. That's part of the commercial activities of running a business in the country. That's a cost of goods. However, again, as an investor in innovation and employment and wanting to push the needle forward on tech in Canada, I look at the dollars that flow from the operators directly into the government coffers and think, how can I get a piece of that? Not me as an individual, me as an industry. How can my industry benefit from some of the dollars that are being transferred to, set aside some funding for, young startups, SMBs, creation of new ecosystems, testing of specific, technology areas. That's sort of where my thinking goes, David, on this subject.
This discussion.
Can I add something on that?
Sure.
Actually, Ben, I mean, I totally agree with you. Actually, David raised the question of what is the criteria of a successful auction? Is it the cost per megahertz per population? Is it the total revenue? Or is it actually the higher it is, the more successful it is, or the lower? Actually, really, we need to rethink, to review all the the auctions, what's the objective of it? I had personally, I mean, for years as an industry, we used to think, oh, this auction was amazing. The cost per megahertz per pop was interesting. The total, I mean, revenue, the auction is much more, for example, than other markets. But maybe actually it's the opposite. Maybe the opposite. The higher the cost per megahertz per population could be equivalent that we're actually moving more money from the telco world, from the money that can be used directly to the consumer, money that is going, I don't know what, I mean, money that's not being used, let's put it like this, directly towards the consumer. So maybe we have to come up with policies that actually will moderate the competition, not to drive it to the extreme and to let the operator spend a lot of actually dollar value, which is actually impacting the telco market. It will impact the telecommunication market. So we have to come up with actually, we have to think differently. This is what I would say when it comes to auction. The objective shouldn't be actually getting only more revenue. We have to balance it. We have to balance it.
That is our time. It is a joy and a privilege to get to speak to three people who are both expert and passionate about this subject that is challenging, but I think is really, really important. So Ben Morris from Wesley Clover, Janette Stewart from Analysis Mason, Jad Berberi from Samsung. Thank you all very much for your time and for your insights. This has really been a privilege. I also want to thank the audience for making the discussion better by sending us questions. Thank all of you for watching, for taking part. Those of you who are not Logic subscribers, there's an opportunity for you to fix that. I think this discussion has been a big part of what we're about. We do journalism that's worth paying for. We tell you things that are worth knowing, and I hope you'll find value in that. I want to thank the Logic's business team for putting this together and making this easy for me to host, particularly Ariel Lepper-Walker, who is the person behind the scenes who did virtually all the heavy lifting. Wouldn't happen without her and the other people on the team. And we have more Logic events coming up. Keep an eye out. We have a great team, people who know many things, who are smart on many subjects, and who will be doing their best to bring that knowledge to you. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, we're everywhere, but particularly we are at thelogic.co. Thank you again. Hope you all have a great day.